Hello out there. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another live stream here from AutoCrit. Now, if you're not familiar with AutoCrit, we are a premier website for writers. We have our fully functional writing desk where you can write, edit, and polish your manuscript. We have a author community with lots of authors like yourself where we talk and exchange and keep ourselves accountable in our daily progress. And we have our Academy page where we offer all kinds of learning opportunities, similar to our quick little workshop we're going to do today about writing short stories. And we also have our author services, which allow for personalized feedback from our industry professionals. Now, I can see already a lot of you are chiming in there. Welcome to all of you from all over the world. Fantastic to have all our AutoCrit members here. If you're not an AutoCrit member, well, you can always become one to go to AutoCrit.com. And I also ask you, if you can, to like and subscribe this feed so that other writers can find us, and also so that you can stay abreast of everything we offer here at AutoCrit. Now, today, as I said, we're going to discuss short stories. Short stories is writing short stories is a very popular topic because short stories are one of the best ways to get your foot in the door as in the industry. Because the demand or the ask of the audience is less with a new author, often readers are more apt to try a short story from a new author. There's a lot of opportunities with magazines and anthologies and other publications to be part of a collection with other authors. So it's a common way that authors get started. However, one of the challenging things about it is that to write a short story is in many ways a different sort of process. It's a different sort of art form. It's a different sort of medium than a typical novel. And so for a writer that typically writes books, or maybe is more inclined to write books, sometimes they can end up falling into that short story category in almost that cynical way, right? It's like, well, I want to do where, I'm going to get noticed, I'm going to get recognized. And the problem with that is they're not going to make a very effective short story. They're simply going to make a story that is short. And those are two different things. All right. So I have some tips about writing short. Not necessarily writing in your shorts, boxers or briefs. No, we're not going to go there. But writing short. What are some ways to make sure your short stories are effective? Well, one thing to keep in mind is it isn't just as simple as writing less words. It is a different art form. A common mistake is something like thinking that it's just your first chapter. Another thing that you need to be concerned with are ways you're going to change your prose style, your writing style. You have to be very careful about what you include in your short story word count. And so specificity is something I'm going to emphasize. It is always important when you're an author to make sure all the words on the page do as much as possible. You don't generally want, you don't generally want something that is just exposition or just information or just character saying something cute. You generally want it to do multiple things, and all the more in a short story because words are at a premium. There is an expectation for a certain amount of concentration in the short story art form. Readers are expecting the word choice to be weighed differently. To be honest, not that we don't polish and edit all of our works, but short stories, there's more of a meticulous effort in the word choice often in a short story than there is in a 120,000 word book, right? Because for one, the amount of effort it would take to get to the 120,000 word book on the level of the editing quality of a short story that's 3,000 words, well, you're just not going to have that same amount of time, right? And some short stories, read very poetically. There's just so much cleverness in every word, and it's not something you see as much in a full-length book. But it's something to keep in mind. In some ways, even though it's an easier art form to enter in, right? Because there's more opportunities for you. The audience is more inclined to give you a chance. On the other hand, I would say the quality can be a lot higher. There's a lot. There's just a lot more of there could be a lot more competition, and so there's a lot more that could be weeded out, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's actually a lot more difficult. But specificity is a great way to help yourself stand out. Again, try to find words that convey as much meaning as possible. So instead of saying, it was a broken down old car, if you instead say it was a clunker, well, you've said almost the same thing and you've used less words. And you want to look for opportunities like that. So just like always, you want to look for those adverbs. You want to look for those emotion words that often do the heavy lifting for what should be specifically called out in other ways. Less length, bigger impact. Very possible, right? It's that concentrated push, which can sometimes be more oomphy than a long book. It's true. I've read short stories that have absolutely leveled me in ways that books have not. A short story is not a first chapter. I just said that a minute ago. But yes, the last thing you want to do is be like, oh, well, if I just want to submit for a short story contest or challenge, I will just take out a first chapter and it'll be fine. No, it's not. And even if you're not doing something as dramatic as that, you don't want to just have a scene be a short story either. It does need to have a beginning and a middle and an end, even if you want to end in a bit of a cliffhanger. And we'll talk about that later. Because yes, there is that opportunity with a short story more so than a book. But it should have a satisfying arc to it. It shouldn't just be kind of things happening for the most part. That is not what you're looking for in a short story. It's not just kind of a slice of life and you're like, you read it and then you wonder, oh, okay, well, that's nice. I kind of want to know what happens next. That's generally not a short story. A short story should feel more contained than that. And that's a common mistake. In late, out early is common advice with writing. But again, all the more for a short story. You don't have a lot of time. So instead of spending a lot of time warming up the audience, why not just jump right to something exciting? You can disorient the audience a little bit in a short story and let them find their footing. That's okay. You don't want to be too disorienting, but what the last thing you want to do is spend a lot of time on mundane setup. Often we tell stories about characters who have a typical life, a typical day, and something really dramatic happens and it shakes things up. And while in a book, you might want to have some of that warm up that it's not always a good idea, even in a book, but you might be able to get away with that warm up, that let's just kind of show what a baseline is. In a short story, it's a very risky thing to do. You're much better off jumping to this is the day that I found out my neighbor was a vampire, and not like in that style, but like something that tells us this is the day that person's going to show up, is going to realize something's a vampire, right? Or it could even be, they're actually finding out in that moment. Again, in late, out early. And then when it says out early, instead of allowing us to really see the reaction of the character in some long-winded way where you kind of have the following action, the denouement, you're not going to generally have as much of that in a short story. Short stories do tend to stop more on a dime than a book. And one of the reasons why is because, well, in a book, you might spend hours and hours and hours with this character, right? So the fact that they've accomplished their goal, you don't want to just be like, that's all, folks, drop the curtain. However, as that example shows in a cartoon, it works just fine. It's like, it's fast and it's punchy, and then it's like, stop, right? And that is satisfying. So with a short story, it's the same thing. You don't have to have the same sort of let's kind of cool down. Think about like a warm-up for exercise, right? If you're exercising for a longer period of time, like a marathon, you need more warm-up, you need more cool down. If you're just doing a quick, couple of push-ups, no, you don't necessarily need that much to calm down afterwards. And the same kind of idea. So, in a sense, is there more telling than showing about the setting in a short story? That is an interesting question. I would say no, you would want actually probably more of the opposite. You would want more showing to get into the specificity, into the drama of the situation, and less telling. Often, when we do telling, those of you who watch this channel will know, I generally say instead of show, don't tell, I say dramatize, don't summarize, right? Um, Short stories should be a lot of drama. You just don't have a lot of time for the other. And if it's not that interesting or not that dramatic, then why are you wasting my time with it when you don't have much of my time, right? In a longer work, well, you might want to have moments where it kind of calms down a little bit to show a difference between the dramatic moments and the quieter moments. Well, in a short story, not so much. You kind of want a dramatic moment and you don't necessarily want too much quiet because, again, you just don't have that much time. Why would you take up my time with that? For sure. It was a great course too. Oh, thank you. Yes, the showing versus telling workshop I just did. But yeah, in terms of how much setting you want to include in a short story, that really will depend on how important the setting is, how dramatic the setting is, etc., etc. You know, for sure. You could have an entire short story that's just about a setting. You know, it's about a setting through the years, perhaps, right? And it's telling the story of an object and how it was passed on from generation to generation. You know, there's so many opportunities, and we'll get to that a little bit later, that you have in a short story that you don't have in longer fiction, or at least are very tricky to do. Now, again, this is something we always say, but all the more before you add, use all that you have, right? Instead of layering on a whole bunch of ideas and giving them short shrift because you barely have time to cover them, why not go deeper in something that's highly interesting, right? And instead of adding something new to it, ask yourself, is this something that what we've already established can have as a extra element? So, for example, instead of another character showing up to express a feeling of dread, well, can't one of the characters that are in the scene right now express a feeling of dread? And you might say, well, no, actually, the characters I have in my scene are very brave. Okay, well, maybe they're brave on average, but maybe giving one of them a sense of dread in that moment actually will give them nuance. It'll make them feel more realistic. It'll be a lot more interesting for the audience, right? Or even the setting, right? You might say, well, I want to have this piece of technology and the setting is actually very antiquated. Well, do you really need to do that? Or is this a more nuanced setting? Is this a setting that on average is very backwards in terms of technology, but for some reason has this more advanced technology? And isn't that kind of interesting, right? So, you know, don't just reach for, oh, if I want this in my story, I got to just put in something new. Think about whether or not you can go deeper in something you already have, and that's just going to save a lot of time. You're not setting up a completely new object or character or setting, and it will enrich what you have. It'll give it more flavor. It's kind of like, you know, rather than just adding a whole bunch of ingredients to a dish, you know, is there something you can do to the ingredients you already have? You know, it's like adding a little bit of seasoning to a vegetable versus adding a whole other vegetable, which eventually you add too much and it's going to get overly complicated or overly stuffed. You know, I'm not trying not to torture that analogy, but I hope you get it. This is a problem you have not just with short stories, with a book, and you keep piling ideas and characters because you're stuck. Yes, this is a common thing that writers will do, right? When they get writer's block, instead of solving the problem, they'll just add more. But that's, again, going to the recipe thing, right? If you find your dish is not generally working, you can just add ingredients to oblivion, right? It's like, well, this isn't very tasty. I'm just going to add this. I don't know about that. It's just going to add this. When really what happened was along the way, you maybe didn't prepare it properly, didn't cook it properly, things like that. And it'll just go out of hand in a hurry. So you do need to be careful with that. It's an easy thing to fall back on. Instead of fixing a broken character or a character that just doesn't seem to be working, or a scenario that doesn't seem to be working, by just adding a new scenario, you know, maybe go back and adjust that. But, you know, it'll depend on the situation. How deep into a character's mindset can you show with a curtailed amount of time? That is a really great question, right? And this is where the quality of the writing matters and the specificity matters. When you get into that specificity of language, you can show a lot about a character's mindset, right? Because what we are focused on tells us what we're thinking. The kind of words we use, are we using positive sort of framework in what we're talking about, right? Because you can describe the same thing in a way that indicates somebody is happy about looking at it or negative about looking about it without saying those things. You don't have to say, oh, I was happy to see that, my spouse did the dishes or something. But you could just say, wow, the dishes were done. What a surprise, right? And that tells you something, right? It tells you the person's happy about it. It also tells you they weren't expecting it. It shows maybe a little bit of antagonism towards the other person because perhaps they don't do it enough. There's a lot baked in there, right? And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for as much subtext as you can tie into those words. And that you could do that over and over again, sentence by sentence, and in a very short amount of time, you can convey a lot. I mean, think of musical lyrics and how much they can convey about a mindset, right? You can have songs that obviously they have the music to help, but just lyrically, you have a sense of joy, fear, melancholy, like all kinds of complicated things. And often, lyrics of songs, you're talking about 200, 300 words, maybe. You got more than that. So yeah, you can totally get deep into a mindset, even though you're limited on words. Don't make it feel like, oh, well, I don't have a lot of time. I can't get that deep. No. You can get very deep, particularly if you don't have too many things to get deep about. And that gets to limiting your characters, right? Generally speaking, in short stories, you do not want to have that many characters that somebody would name at the end of your story. A lot of short stories only have one. Now, that's not necessary. You can have more than that. But I would say you want to be careful. There isn't I'm not going to give you a hard and fast rule. It's like no more than 3 named characters ever, because you'll find examples where that isn't the case. But generally speaking, I would say you don't want too many. More than 3 is probably a risky thing to do for a short story, especially if it's on the shorter end of a short story. But that doesn't mean you can't have more individuals in the story. I mean characters, right? You could totally have a short story about somebody in Times Square and there's a hustle and a bustle and they're talking about all the different types of people that are there, and what you're monitoring is the main character's reaction to all of these different types of people. Right? And all those different types of people are not really characters. They're just kind of foils for the main character to react to. That's what I mean by limiting the characters. I don't mean you can't have a lot of things going on in your story. But there should only be one, well, not the one, but there should be few characters that we're that invested in, we're getting that deep in. Because if you don't do that, it means we're just going to get a shallow look at a lot of different characters. And that's not generally the best idea. In fact, I would say it's pretty much never a great idea. Characters are really the number one way that people relate to narrative fiction. So, be very careful. High concepts, yes, are interesting. What if scenarios are great, but characters matter more than any of it. You can have a really compelling story about a character doing the most mundane task you could ever imagine, right? This is actually one great thing about a short story, is you have opportunities for things like that. And we'll get to that in a second, some of the opportunities you might have. Yes, opportunity for experiments. So, for example, you would not necessarily, or at least it would be highly difficult, tell a 120,000 word book about somebody who is neurodivergent doing a mundane task, right? But maybe you would tell a short story like that, particularly maybe you are somebody who does think that way and you're trying to give people an insight to kind of what it's like in your own head. And you want to help them grow some empathy. And you also want to show them something they can't see, which is the world from a different lens. Yeah, you could totally do that in a short story and tell a really compelling story about how something that's really easy for you is very difficult for this person, right? I mean, I could do that. There are some things that I find incredibly complicated, that for a lot of other people, they couldn't care less about. And I wouldn't say that's going to make a compelling story you're going to spend 5 or 6 hours with, but 10 minutes? Yeah, Absolutely, you can do that. There's so many other things, anti-heroes, characters that, maybe you wouldn't want to be in the point of view for, again, hours upon hours, right? But for a couple minutes, it's an interesting thing to explore. What if scenarios that perhaps you don't feel like you want to, excuse me, you don't have the capability of, or you just don't want to go on for a very long period of time because it's such a weird high concept, right? It's very abstract or peculiar. I mean, the Twilight Zone is a great example of shorter, it's not movie length, right? The episodes are maybe like 20, 25 minutes long. And there's a lot of them that if they try to make them movie length, they wouldn't have worked very well. It was perfect at that length. It was just enough time to explore it from a psychological perspective, make you interested, have twists, all of those things. It's the same thing with short fiction, right? So in some ways, it's a wonderful art form because short stories have more opportunities for you to do the wild and crazy things that books, it's just a harder ask because books are more investment of somebody's time, and it could be a lot harder to sustain something like a high end concept for that period of time. Which is one reason why you'll notice a lot of high concepts, don't work very well like as long form television shows or long book series because they just start to unravel. They don't make a lot of sense because it's really fun and interesting to play around with, but it doesn't hold together because it's kind of too contrived, right? You can be very contrived in a short story in a way that you can't be in a book because, again, you're not asking me to be interested in it for hours upon hours. It's more of, have you ever thought about this? And you're like, oh, yeah, that's kind of fun. Let me play around with this a little bit. And then you're out, right? So it's a very different situation. Endings, yes. Short stories are different in that endings can be quite a lot of different things. You can have endings that are cliffhangers, uh, kind of the classic example of somebody having to make a horrible decision and you don't tell them what decision they made and the audience is left thinking about it. That's a common ending of a short story that in a book, no, you would be very risky to do that because the audience expectation is well, if I've spent all these hours with the characters, if I've gotten emotionally invested in the story, if I'm like, on the edge of my seat, you need to let me know what happened because otherwise it's a cop out. In a short story, no, there is not the same expectation. Now, I'm not saying that means that you should just cop out and just paint yourself into a corner and be like, haha, figure it out, because there is a way to do it properly, right? You do need it. Generally, it works best when there's good reasons for multiple things that could happen, and the asking the question of the audience as to what comes next tends to take some sort of ethical or moral dilemma into consideration or things like that. And so you're asking a complicated moral question, and instead of giving the audience an answer, you're letting them parse it out. That generally tends to be the best use of this. But there's other endings. You can have an ending in a short story where you might end up a little bit confused as to what exactly happened, and you have to go back and reread it in order for it to make complete sense. This, again, is a risky thing to do. It would be devastating to do in a book for the most part. You could maybe argue like Agatha Christie maybe did this a couple times. But generally, but that's a specific audience, right? People like a puzzle. But in a short story, yeah, you can a little bit more easily get away with it where it's like, oh, but you missed something in the meticulous detail that I put in. So go back and read it again and you'll catch it. You have to clue the audience in some way that that's what's going on, because otherwise they're going to get to the end. They'll be like, okay. But if you clue into the audience, it's like, yeah, there was something kind of there and you missed it. Go back. And then you're like, oh, and then they read it back. And again, because you don't have that much to go through, you only have a few thousand words. Yeah, the audience is okay going back and kind of meticulously reading, especially because you're dealing with an audience who enjoys word choice, who enjoys literature as an art form. So yeah, they're going to want to go back and they'll read it and they'll be like, oh, that is very clever how you did that. You love well-written short stories in the horror genre that have really twisted endings. Yeah. Twist endings are much more believable in a short story, much more accepted. I say this often about secrets in literature. They are dangerous because secrets to the audience is essentially misleading the audience. It's almost like a lie because up until the point the secret is revealed, the audience is under a false belief about what is going on. So then once it is revealed, the audience is going to either say, oh, well, that's way more interesting than what I thought all this time. Why didn't you just tell me all this time? What were you doing? Or they're going to be like, well, I liked it the way it was. Why did you mess it up? Right? It's very risky. Now, there are times that it's just such a fun reveal because it does make you rethink what you saw before, that therefore you're like, wow, that just blew my mind, and now I got to go back. But in a short story, it's a lot easier to get away with this because, again, the audience was not under that false assumption for nearly as long. They don't have that emotional baggage of investment, of concern over whatever it was they were under a false impression about. And so the fact that they have to go back and kind of redo it, well, they're not having to throw out very much. And so it's an easier thing to do. So if you want to play with plot twists or kind of shock endings, short stories are much better at this than books a lot of the time. And I know you'll point to examples of books or movies that have shock endings. But like I said, in general, it's better to do it in short. And again, going back to the Twilight Zone, it was a staple of that show. That a lot of the endings were kind of big shock endings. But again, if you think about it, if the same story was presented in the course of a movie, you would probably find that the shock ending would annoy you or something like that. Life of Pi. Oh yeah, that's a good example of an ending that would be typically more of something you would expect in a short story. That actually does work pretty well in the long form book. But it's a dangerous thing to do. All right, so some of these tips are things that I'm going to be talking about in greater detail in our short story lab that's coming up next week on Monday. And I know somebody here has already signed up for it. So shout out to Zula, and who said who has musical lyrics, great comparison, but you mentioned it earlier. Here it is. Yes, because you registered for the short story workshop. Well, welcome. And if you want to register for the short story lab, you can sign up right here. The fun thing about this is, unlike our other courses, because it's a short story, we're going to be able to take you through the entire process. For the fantasy course, which also starts soon, it starts tonight, I'll talk about it in a minute, we're talking about writing a whole book. And we don't have time in 4 weeks to write a whole book, at least unless you're Brandon Sanderson. Normally, that isn't the case. But a short story, yes, in 4 weeks, we can, in fact, go from beginning to, the idea, to the writing, to the editing. You may not be at the point after 4 weeks that you would submit it to the most prestigious publishing house necessarily, but you can get it into really good shape for sure. And you can certainly go back once the course is over, look at all of our tips and tricks, and just keep honing in and keep making it better and better. Even though the sessions are live, they are recorded, and you can always come back to them at a later date and learn more from them. Now, if you're an AutoCrit member tonight, we have our Fantasy Club. So that is included in your AutoCrit Pro membership. We have it every week. Tonight, we're going to talk about story beats, and we're going to have a few new members, I hope, from our fantasy class, which also starts tonight. So if you're not an AutoCrit Pro member, this is a nice way to kind of sneak your way in, as it were, because as part of the courses, we do give you a pro membership for 30 days. So you can join AutoCrit Story Sorcery in the Quest to Write a Stronger Fantasy. That's a mouthful, right? Story Sorcerer in the Quest to Write Stronger Fantasy, which is a 4-week fantasy course with yours truly. Begins tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up at that link. And like I said, it'll include AutoCrit Pro membership, which includes the Fantasy Club, the Accountability Club, and the Horror Club. The Horror Club takes place on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and the Accountability Club takes place at 11 a.m. on Mondays. All right, so What's going on in the AutoCrit world here? First time tonight, you need direction with the plot. Well, tonight is a great night to show up for that. Even if you do not write fantasy, still show up tonight because we're going to be talking about plot beats, and plot beats apply to everyone. I will be talking specifically from the framework of fantasy, but really it'll be all different sorts. You signed up. Woohoo! Oh, you can't wait to see you there, Betsy. How many words do you like to write in a short story? Short stories are generally quite strict in terms of the publication. So they often have quite strict standards. On a broad spectrum of 1,000 words tends to be a very short story. 10,000 words is when you start to go into novella territory. I would say 5 to 7,000 is pretty common, but you will see a range depending on publication and whatnot. And so that is something to keep in mind, before you sit down and like, I'm going to write a whatever story and I'm going to submit it to a bunch of places. You might want to look at some of those submission guidelines, right? Because that will help you pick the right scope of a story. Because even though all short stories tend to have a narrower scope than a book, I would say a 2,000 word short story has a narrower scope than an 8,000 word story, right? Because it's 25% of the material. So you do want to keep that in mind. Other than the length is dictated by a publisher, how would you define the length of a short story? Oh, I just did that. Thank you. Yeah, it's not like an exact science, but like under 1,000 tends to be considered more like flash fiction. Really, 2,000 is more common. 1,000 would be awfully short, and over 10,000 you start to get into what is often considered to be the novella level or microfiction. Yes, it's another way of looking at it. 5,000 words sounds good. Yeah, it's kind of like split the difference right in the middle. Do I recommend italics as a way to convey characters' thoughts to keep it short? Yes, in that, yes, you should think of things like that, right? There are different ways that you can have brevity. One thing is simple is get into a deep POV. That can help. So instead of saying, Shirley walked into the room and she saw a lamp in the corner, and then she turned, and in the other corner was a bookshelf, right? Instead, you could say, Shirley walked into the room. There was a lamp in the corner and a bookshelf in the corner, because we're just in their head, right? We don't need to understand that the reason why they're seeing the things is because they're seeing the things. We can see the things because they can see the things, right? It's just inferred. It saves you a lot of time. And it also gets you more into the feeling like you are in their headspace. All right. You love 6-word stories. Yeah, that's a very, very short story. That really would be more, micro fiction or flash fiction, however you want to put it. They call it what, drabbles sometimes, right? Something like that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me again. Please like and subscribe this feed for more tips and tricks from AutoCrit.com. We're here every week. We do have some special guests coming up at the beginning of May, so stay tuned to this channel for that. On May 9th, we have some, I don't want to announce it just yet because, it's a couple weeks out, but maybe you already know. You've been looking around our channel. You can look around our channel and you want to find out. So I'll let you do a deep dive on that. But we have on May 9th, we have some special guests coming up, and it'll be a lot of fun. And like I said, always something going on in the AutoCrit world. So please join us at AutoCrit.com as well. And I'll see you all around. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining me today.